You already know where babies come from. But here is the question nobody ever asks. How did the very first humans figure it out? Because nobody told them. There was no explanation. No one had figured it out before them. And when scientists finally pieced together the answer, it turned out to be one of the strangest detective stories in all of human history. The mystery starts with a gap. 9 months. That is the distance between cause and effect. And for your ancestors, that gap was invisible. Your brain is built to connect things that happen close together in time. Touch fire, feel pain. That connection takes 1 second to learn. But 9 months? That is 270 days between action and consequence. The human brain was never designed to bridge that gap on its own. And for tens of thousands of years, it did not. So what did your ancestors think was happening instead? The answer is stranger than you expect. In 1914, anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski sailed to the Trobriand Islands in the southwestern Pacific to study one of the most isolated cultures on Earth. These were not primitive people. They were skilled navigators, farmers, and traders with complex social systems and rich oral traditions. But what Malinowski discovered when he asked about childbirth stopped the academic world cold. The Trobriand Islanders had absolutely no concept of biological fatherhood, none. They believed that children were created when ancestral spirits entered a woman's body, during sleep or while she was bathing in the sea. The man she lived with had nothing to do with it. When Malinowski explained the Western understanding of how conception actually worked, the Islanders did not argue. They laughed. It seemed to them completely absurd. This was not one isolated case. Across dozens of cultures studied in the 19th and 20th centuries, from Aboriginal Australians to tribes in Papua New Guinea to groups in Central Africa, the same pattern appeared. Children came from spirits, from sacred sites, from certain foods eaten during pregnancy, from rivers, winds, and ancestral forces. The biological connection between sex and birth was unknown or doubted or actively rejected as a foreign idea that made no sense. Your ancestors were not stupid. They were missing data. And the data was hidden inside a 9-month black box that no amount of careful observation could easily crack. So how did they crack it? This is where the story gets genuinely fascinating. The breakthrough almost certainly did not come from watching humans at all. It came from watching animals. Specifically, from the moment humans stopped following animals and started keeping them. Roughly 10,000 years ago, in the region that is now Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, your ancestors began domesticating goats and sheep. This was not just an economic shift. It was an observational revolution. For the first time in human history, your ancestors could watch the entire reproductive cycle of another species in a controlled environment. They knew which male had been with which female. They could track the gap. And in animals, the gap is shorter. A goat carries a kid for about 150 days. A sheep, 147. Short enough, controlled enough, observed closely enough that the pattern finally became impossible to ignore. Picture it. A herder separates a female goat from all males. Months pass, no offspring. He introduces one male. Months later, kids appear. He does it again. Same result, and again. The experiment runs itself over and over in the fields and pens of the earliest farming communities. And somewhere in that repetition, a mind made the leap. The act caused the outcome. The gap was not magic. It was biology. This is supported by what we see in the archaeological record. The earliest known symbolic representations of human reproduction, fertility figurines, cave markings, carved images, appear in hunter-gatherer cultures and are almost entirely focused on women and birth, with almost no representation of the male role. Then, after the domestication of animals, the symbolism shifts. Male animals and their role in reproduction begin appearing in art and ritual. The invisible became visible, and the culture recorded it. Now, here is the fact that tends to make people stop and reconsider everything. This discovery, when it finally arrived, may have made life harder for women rather than easier. Before paternity was understood, most early human kinship systems appear to have been matrilineal. Children belonged to the mother's line because the mother's line was the only certain one. A child always had a known mother. But before the animal-keeping revolution, a child had no knowable father. That structure gave women a particular kind of social centrality. The mother and her relatives were the stable unit. Men moved between groups. Children inherited through their mother. The moment paternity became knowable, everything changed. If a man could now be identified as a biological father, he had an heir, an inheritance to pass on, a line to continue. And for that to matter, he needed certainty, which meant controlling who the woman he lived with had access to. Property, inheritance, and lineage, concepts that would eventually build civilization, all required paternity, and paternity required something new: the control of women's bodies as a social and economic concern. Evolutionary psychologist David Buss spent years studying jealousy across 37 different cultures in the 1990s and found that the specific pattern of male sexual jealousy, concern with sexual fidelity, access, and exclusivity, appeared universally across every culture he studied, regardless of geography or social structure. His conclusion was that this pattern is not learned, it is ancient. It is the behavioral echo of a world where paternity suddenly mattered, and where uncertainty about it carried real consequences for survival and inheritance. You carry that echo today. The instincts that feel personal and emotional have a history that stretches back to a herder in ancient Anatolia, watching his goats and making a connection that changed the world. But return for a moment to the man who never made that connection. His name was Ishi. In 1911, a terrified, starving man walked out of the wilderness in Northern California and surrendered near a slaughterhouse. He was the last surviving member of the Yahi people, a group that had hidden from American settlers for decades after their community was massacred. Anthropologist Alfred Kroeber took him in, and for 5 years, Ishi lived at the University of California's Museum of Anthropology, sharing everything he knew about his people's world. What Kroeber documented was a complete picture of a Stone Age mind navigating a modern city. Ishi could identify hundreds of plants by function, track animals across bare rock, read weather from cloud formations. His knowledge of the natural world was extraordinary, but his explanations for birth, illness, and death came from a world of spirits and forces. He was not ignorant. He was the product of a knowledge system that had never made the animal-keeping leap. The specific chain of observation that revealed the invisible 9-month connection had never run in his culture. Ishi died in 1916. People who were alive when he walked out of that forest are within living memory today. The distance between a mind that did not know and a mind that does is not thousands of years of evolution. It is one insight, one controlled observation, one moment when the gap closed and the pattern became clear. Here is what that means for you right now. The reason your ancestors took so long to figure this out was not a failure of intelligence. In 2010, psychologist Vivian Zayas at Cornell University confirmed through research on delayed consequences that the human brain is structurally poor at linking cause to effect across long-time gaps. It is not a cultural problem. It is a cognitive architecture problem. Your brain's pattern recognition system was built for a world where consequences arrived in seconds. 9 months sits at almost the exact outer limit of what an unaided human mind can reliably connect through observation alone, which means the people who lived without this knowledge were not failing to think. They were thinking correctly with the tools they had. They observed the world. They found patterns. They built explanations that fit what they could see. And when new data arrived, when the goats in the pen made the invisible visible, they updated. That is not primitive. That is exactly how science works. You already know where babies come from, but now you know something more interesting: how long it took to figure out what finally cracked it open, and how much of the world you live in was built on the day that knowledge arrived. The gap closed 10,000 years ago in a field somewhere in ancient Turkey. And you have been living inside the consequences ever since.